I'm going to start the timer. Again, it's going to be 20 minutes of just writing. This first 20 minutes usually is like you spend it opening your document, figuring out where you were, remembering what you were thinking about, maybe taking notes and stuff like that. And that second 20 minutes is usually when you get into the groove of things. So let me just find the timer one more time, and then we're going to go ahead and start it because I want to make sure you guys can see it on your screen. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to start this 20 minutes. We're going to start writing, and then we're going to stop after that, and I'm going to answer questions. Right, okay. Okay, that was 20 minutes and it went by really fast. Okay, so now that you've gotten your hands on the project you're working on, what questions do you guys have? They don't have to be about what you're writing today. They can be about screenwriting in general, storytelling in general. If anybody is working on a documentary or a poem or any other kind of storytelling, what I tell my students all the time is storytelling takes place in all these different forms. So if you guys have any storytelling questions at all or career building questions, this would be the time for that.
If you're trying to write a story and portray a story in some type of like a, for it to be like a cinematic production, you want to keep the essence of like what the story is, but you want to also like what she's saying, but you want to also, how do I say this? There needs to be some type of like climax and reason for the story, right? So it doesn't be flat, so it doesn't go flat.
Right.
How would you recommend doing that or looking into a story that has already been told? Do you look for key elements and points?
I think, okay, so first, just to answer, I think the subtext of your question, which is about historical integrity. I come from the world of documentary. That's where I got my start. And the way that we look at it is it's more important to tell the truth than to tell what is true. So, for example, if you're telling the story about someone who's overcome traveling through like harsh environmental hardships, right? Snow, hail, sleet, whatever, and they get through on the other side. That's the true thing that you have to tell. You don't want to then change the story and say, okay, they overcame something that is completely irrelevant. But if it is more compelling for it to happen in Minnesota as opposed to Omaha, then taking that creative license doesn't take away the essence of the story. So that's the ethical line that I draw. Everyone else has to draw their own ethical line. But my personal opinion, the way I teach it, is more important to tell what is true than to tell the truth than what is true. So to answer your other question, I don't think more along the lines of picking out certain pieces of the story to find what's compelling. I think more along the lines of a timeline. So, looking at the breadth of this person's life, because this was a real human being, and you look at the day she was born and the day she died, and then you want to figure out where along that timeline does the most compelling story happen. Because let's say you're writing a feature that's 90 minutes. What is the 90 minutes of her life that has a very clear beginning, middle, and end that's going to be compelling for people to watch? Whereas the part that was, recorded by this man that she talked to may have been when she was like 77, and um there were certain ups and downs that were interesting and funny stories that happened there. But you may take, as the writer now, because you're not that guy and you have free reign over this whole historical um timeline, you may take a step back and say, yes, that was really interesting, and the high drama really did happen when she was between 34 and 35, except as a creative, all of that stuff that happened between when she was 34 and 35 is a result of what happened between the ages of 7 and 10. And so I'd rather tell a story of what happened between the ages of 7 and 10, because it shows like this tenderness, this coming of age, and that's where the most change happens in her life that makes her the person that she becomes, that wins an award at 30, whatever. So I would take a look at the timeline of her life and figure out for you what speaks to you, because you as the writer are going to find the most potent, juicy, sexy, sink your teeth into it elements, because that's the part that speaks to you. And a lot of times as writers, what we end up reflecting on the page is always about what we're grappling with as human beings ourselves, what we don't understand about the world ourselves, what we're trying to figure out about the human experience ourselves. And what interests you about her life could be the part that's famous that everybody knows, or it could be about something completely different.
Thank you.
Yep. Anybody else? No? Are we ready for another 20 minutes? Okay, good. So I'm going to share my screen again and we'll go into another 20 minutes of writing. Ooh. Mm. Bree, how are things going with you? I haven't heard from you yet.
I know my introduction is struggle bus boomer moment, so my fault. It's
No
fine.
worries. Welcome. We're glad you're here.
Yeah, happy to
Okay.
be here. No, I'm good. I'm a novice at everything I do, but I want to do it all. So I am actually here because you did a TikTok on like encouraging people who are novelists and writers to break it apart, start from the bare bones, and then you can still turn it into a script. And that was the first positive insight I had heard about being able to do it. So that's why I'm here.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so I am figuring it out as I go, but I'm gonna figure it out with y'all.
All we have to do is break it down in little steps. My mom used to always say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So the very first step is figuring out, okay, if I want it to be a television show, is it going to be a half hour or hour show? And we usually make that decision by deciding what the comedy factor is on the show. So a half hour is usually a comedy or a dramedy, and an hour is usually more like a straight drama. Usually at the half hour mark, what we have is either a comedy or a dramedy, which it could be like a straight comedy, like Abbott Elementary, or just a straight comedy. Or you have more of a dramedy, which would be something more like Insecure, which is just like comedy led with dramatic moments, right? So if we're saying that we're gonna go the hour route, then we're really um making a firm decision that I can confirm that my story does not live in that world. It lives in this world. And that doesn't mean that there's not levity. All the time there's levity in like our shows. All the time. But it's led by something more dramatic, you know, family dramas, horror, suspense, what it sounds like, the wheelhouse of your story. So if that's the case, that's great. That means we're looking at a structure that's upwards of 60 pages. It doesn't have to be 60 pages on the dot. A lot of times you'll see something anywhere between like 48 all the way to like 63, but you don't really want to go much lower than like 50 pages, and you don't want to go much higher than like page and a half over 60 something if you can. Um just because that's industry standard. And as much as a lot of times streamers will have a 40 something episode of a show, because they don't have to go by those rules because commercials, blah blah blah. Unfortunately and fortunately, we're still in a place where, because that's industry standard, you don't want anybody to look at it and be like, oh, she doesn't know what she's doing. And the structure is going to boil down to how many acts you have in a television show. So for you, for an hour show, that's usually anywhere between 4 to 6 acts. A half hour show can be 3 acts, 4 acts. I haven't really seen them above that for a half hour show. And then for an hour show, I've seen them be 4 acts, 5 acts. I rarely see 6 acts, but I have seen it. I've I've written a pilot that was 6 acts once. Um, Okay, and then deciding how many acts is just basically figuring out how quickly the plot turns over, because each act has its own job, right? The first act establishes the characters, the second act establishes another problem, the third. So, because each act accomplishes a different thing narratively, then let's say if you only had 3 acts, that's like a big chunk of pages that accomplish one main narrative beat over 3 times. So you can imagine how like slowly the plot turns over when there's only 3 acts. But if there's 5 acts, the plot has to turn over like this to make it 5 acts by the end of the episode. That doesn't mean that the pacing of the show is quick, right? Because the pacing doesn't have to be fast. A lot of times for a half hour show, you just hear people talk real fast. So that pacing can feel quick depending on like the writing. So you take a show like Scandal, the way that Shonda writes is like very, very, very fast. Like people, it's very witty, very quick banter back and forth. But that doesn't mean that she has 6 acts in her episode, right? it means you're not looking at the pacing of the action, you're looking at how quickly the narrative changes. So, you can feel it kind of in your gut when you watch TV, and I think you'll start to see it now. Whenever there's like a big change, like somebody gets killed, that's the end of the act. And then we come back and it's people in a hospital and it's slowed down. You know that act is just ended. You could feel it. So in traditional television, at the end of the act, there's a commercial break. With ad-supported streaming, you kind of feel it, but you can't point to it and say, "Oh yeah, now we're watching a car commercial." That's the end of the second act. So you kind of have to pay attention a little bit more. But they're still there. At the end of act, we call it act out. And when a writer's writing an act out, you usually try to have some kind of um like intense moment. It doesn't have to be a cliffhanger, but you want like a powerful act out. So I've written like a pilot before, and somebody's like, your act out isn't strong enough. Because traditionally, your act out has to keep people sustained through commercial breaks because that's how you sell television shows is through commercials. So if you want your audience to come back after the commercial break, you have to give them an act out that feels suspenseful enough where you're like, how are they gonna figure that out? I'm gonna sit through this, Cheez-Its commercial.
Yes.
And then if you're willing to sit through the Cheez-Its commercial, then I can sell you this, I can sell this television show. So that's kind of how you want to plan to end each act is like, how do I get the audience to come back? How is that moment enticing, salacious enough? And those beats that you feel, you're going to start to feel them kind of in your gut. Those beats are going to be your way to be like, oh, this show has 3 acts. This show has 4 acts. This show has 5 acts. You're going to be able to see that now. Okay. So I'm saying all of that to say that once you decide how quickly the story should turn over, then you'll have a better sense of how many acts you should have per episode and therefore how to structure your show. So let's say if you say I have a hour show, I want to have 4 acts. I think that's going to be appropriate. You're not marrying it. It can change. Um, but that's kind of where you want to start. Then you can look up, okay, how do I write a 4 act pilot? There's like a bunch of articles that are Googleable. No Film School has a lot of articles that really break down structure. But if you Google it, there's a lot of different organizations that give out that kind of information for free. I think No Film School does it really well. And if you can't find anything, let me know and I'll send you an article that I have that'll just break down how many acts. So, because what you want to look at is like what each act should be accomplishing. Page 1 through 10, I should establish my characters and establish the problem. Pages 12 through 17, I should then solve that problem and start a new problem. Pages whatever through whatever, I should deepen the relationships. Once you figure out what each act is supposed to accomplish, then you have a better sense of what are all the things that should be happening in your pilot. So I would say the biggest thing for you between now with your novel and then what I talked about where you're going, I would say I would take the biggest chunk and then bring it down. Okay, so I know I have it. I have the story. It's in my head. I wrote it. I know it better than anybody. Now, what is my show? If I say I think my show is probably around 4 seasons, 7 episodes each
Curious, is there a
season. So
disconnect in
spread
my
your
mind
story out
that when I
along
picture
that
a
timeline.
series, I can't get
And then
past
you
like
say
a
each
mini
season
series,
should have
Apple
an arc
plus kind of
about
situation?
a different thing. And then you make it to your first season. You're not writing all these episodes. So then you make it to your first season. The first season's arc is about this. Okay, if the first season's arc is about this, then the pilot episode plants that arc. And then that's how I know what happens in my pilot episode. Miniseries are fine. It's hard to sell miniseries. Um, and it's not only reason it's hard to sell miniseries is because when people make it an investment in a show, They want to be able to, the show to be around long enough to feel like they're making a return on their investment. So let's say if you make a show and then you build a set and make all of that financial investment and it only goes for one season, then you barely got, it off the runway um before you can recoup that money. But it happens all the time. Usually, though, for miniseries, what they're looking for is more like award baiting material. So the point of the miniseries is not to make money; it's to be a prestigious show and hire Steven Spielberg to direct it and Nicole Kidman to act in it. And the point of it is not to make money. And for a lot of us who are earlier in our career, it's difficult to sell a prestige show because that investment is not making its money back, and you're investing in a writer that nobody knows yet. So for emerging writers, it's easier, not impossible. Nothing is impossible. You can do whatever you want to do, but it's easier sometimes to sell a show that has potential to go on and on and on. With that being said, if you feel strong that this is a miniseries, it's a miniseries and that's just it. And people are just going to have to deal with it. However, I do think there's something to be said about it being difficult to think outside of the parameter of your book because you've been living with the book for so long. You know that story like the back of your head. What the difference between moving the book to a series is you're not retelling the book. The book already exists in its own art form. The series is taking these characters and the conflict between these characters and telling a separate story. That doesn't mean that it's completely different. That means that because it's a different art form, that you're telling a different slice of that story. So think about it this way. If I were to write a poem, there's this really famous poem that takes place in a train station. Beautiful poem. It won like some big award. And people are coming and going, blah, 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 blah. Beautiful poem. That format works beautifully for a poem. But if I were to then make a film about that poem, I would then go to the train station, forget the poem, go into the train station and tell a narrative about maybe the conductor who lives there and his backstory and the things that he sees. Now, it's the same narrative, it's the same situation. Maybe that man was in the poem. But because what's appropriate for the new format has to do with digging into the character in a separate way, then I need to take the guardrails off of what's possible because I'm dealing with a new format. Television is a long form storytelling format that ideally could go on forever and ever and ever. So now you have to rethink about how these characters are operating in the world. Some of them may not live in the television versions. All of them may make it to the television version. But what makes a television show sing is what we call legs. Whenever you're selling a television show, they want to know, does it have legs? A television show having legs means that there's a engine, what we call an engine in a show that keeps it going episode after episode after episode. That engine is based on the the core ingredients of the show. So for example, you have a show like Breaking Bad. What's the engine of that show? Well, you have a man who has a startup business. Now, the plot could be that he's selling drugs, and the plot could be that he has cancer. The plot could be all this stuff. That is neither here nor there. The engine of the show is this man has a startup business. The drug business is a business. And if you go and look back at it, every season of that show is a different phase in the startup business trajectory, right? First season is about like getting material. Second season is about getting new customers. Second season is about like competitiveness and breaking into a new market, blah, 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 blah. Okay, that's the engine of the show. And a million shows about a business could take that same engine and use it with a different plot. Maybe a legitimate business, maybe another illegitimate business. So for you, I want you to be thinking of what is the engine of my show. You don't have to worry about not respecting your book because the book is done and it lives on the inside of you. You are not going to water down your story by rethinking of the engine in this new art form. Let's jump back into writing. Does that sound good? All right.
I have a question. When
Okay.
you are doing the outline for the screenplay, is there is there a way to like structure out like timing wise, like what should you be putting, like how long are the acts in a feature film is what I'm kind of trying to ask. Typically, does it
Like how
depend?
many pages per
Yes.
each act? Okay, so that is a little flexible, but think of it like a sandwich where the first act is a piece of bread and the third act is a piece of bread. But this is not a regular sandwich. This is a sandwich from Publix. I don't know if you're familiar with Publix sandwiches.
Oh, we got Publix out here in Nashville.
Yeah.
Because at
Yes.
home, the second act may be this big, but at Publix, the second act is this big.
Ah, okay.
So, I would
It's a
say
really good way to explain it. I think I kind of the imagery.
yeah. So it's less about like let people say the first act should be around 11 pages, the last act should be around 9 pages, and everything else is in between. I say maybe that's true, but I think if you structure it well, that it's automatically going to end up the way it's supposed to be.
Hmm.
So think of it more like what should be happening in each act, and that is going to be a natural representation of like how long they should be.
Okay.
Do you have a good sense of that?
Yeah. Okay. So is act two or act three, is that supposed to be like when do you start like implementing maybe like more of like the climactic moments? Because I have through act one, I do have establishing the character. And act two, I feel like we're getting to know the character more and then like also maybe introducing some like the protagonist type of things. And um she's like struggling with death with her husband, and he died from tuberculosis, and then she marries another guy and then they have a son and all this stuff. And it's kind of like her coming home. Is that supposed to be, should that be in like an act two, or should that her like coming home is like the climactic point of that? Should that be in act two or act three, do you think?
Almost everything happens in Act Two.
In act two? Okay.
Almost everything happens in Act Two.
I feel like I'm asking the wrong questions. I need to learn how to ask better questions.
No, you're asking good questions. So, let me see. I think I can do this on here. Here we go. There are a few things that have to happen in Act One. Okay, so you in Act One, you have the status quo, and you have your inciting incident. And then most of the time you have what I call reaction to inciting incident. Okay. So that is Act One. Then in Act Two, you have your point of no return. Your climax, your lowest, no, not your lowest point, your trigger, and lowest point. And literally, I'm sure that other people do not teach it this way. This is just the way that I teach it. And then Act Two, you have your lasting change and your conclusion. So every script does not follow a traditional 3-act structure, and this can get more, I say blended, like ombre-ish over time, but these are like the core things you want to think of. Okay, so in Act One, we have your character status quo. So the world of your character before anything major happens,
Mhm.
right? Because there's the the story, as you mentioned, I think the very first thing you said is every story has to have a reason for being.
Yeah.
So the reason for being is going to be your inciting incident. That's the reason for being. What happens to this person? They're going about their life, whether their life was terrible or wonderful or somewhere in between. Every story has a character, and then bam, something happens, and then that's why we're telling this story.
Mhm.
So it's somebody going about their life and they hate their job, but then they lose their job. Now they have to pursue what they're really passionate about, and that's why we're following them, or whatever the story ends up being. So we want to start off with the status quo, because if we didn't have a status quo, then the inciting incident happening wouldn't have impact, because we don't know how different that is from where they're coming from, where they started. So we
Yes.
have a status quo, what is their life? And then we have the inciting incident, what is inserted into their life that changes things. And then usually you have like a small reaction to that. So if they lose their job, maybe they go out drinking one night and hook up with a stranger or something, whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Then we have the point of no return, which is the decision that they make in a reaction to this inciting incident. So, for example, if they lost their job, maybe they have to move back in with their parents. Okay, so maybe that's the breadth of the story, moving back to a small town and learning the true meaning of blah blah blah, Hallmark movie, dot 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 dot, right? But them getting in the car and like packing it up and driving it to Omaha, I don't know, I've said Omaha like 3 times today, but
It's
wherever
okay.
they're
I'm from
from.
North Dakota. It's all there. I regionally, I'm there.
That scene is like, because we have to remember, film is a visual art form, so it's not just about what's happening internally. If I don't see it, they didn't do it.
Right.
So them like getting in the car and packing it up and whatever, that is the beginning of Act Two.
Mm.
I wonder if I can,
Beginning of it. Okay.
yeah. Um, there's not a, I'm just getting to know this. So I don't know. I want to put like a sexy little thing there, but I'll just do this.
I have been drawing on this. I'm so sorry. I don't know how.
You said you've been what?
I started drawing on it. I'm like, what is happening? And I'm sorry. I'll stop touching the screen.
Where? I don't even
That's
see it.
awesome.
No, look, like, see those
Oh, I see
lines?
it to the right.
Where?
I'm so sorry interrupting everything.
Okay.
That is so funny.
Okay, so this is getting in the car is going to be like that's the beginning of the second act, right?
Mhm.
Um, and then you have the climax, which is usually around here. So them getting in the car, mom, dad, oh, I miss you so much, blah blah blah. I'm seeing old high school friends, whatever. Anyway, so then the climax, let's see if I can duplicate this. Usually happen, oh no. Usually happens about right here. And that is your character getting what they think that they want without changing.
Mm.
Now, we need to talk about character development for just a second. The reason why this works is because you've developed your character with a tangible want and an internal obstacle. Each character, each main character needs that. They need something that they're going after from beginning to end. What do they want? They want a new job. They want a rich husband. They want to win the spelling bee. They want to take over their father's business. They want to win a Grammy, like whatever that thing is, it has to be something tangible. It can't be like they want to forgive themselves, because remember, film is nothing but sight and sound. I don't know what forgiving themselves looks like or sounds like. That's not a thing I can see on camera. Um, in order to have a satisfying conclusion at the end of the movie, I have to see it and hear it.
Mhm.
So whatever that one is, I want to survive this Holocaust or whatever. That's a tangible one. Did she die? Did she not die? Right? I have to be able to say, did she or didn't she? So this is a character getting close to what they want, but without changing the internal thing that has kept them from getting what they want the whole time. A lot of times when we read or learn about screenwriting, we learn that there is some obstacle out there in the world. There is a comet coming from Earth. There's a alcoholic mother. There's a mean teacher. There's a terrible boss. And so we think our character is up against that like external force. But that just makes a flat character.
Mhm.
Because in reality, what we're up against in real life is not out there, it's in here.
Mhm.
So the plot may be racism or sexism or your grandmother who beat you. That might be the plot, but that's not really what the character is up against. The character is up against low self-worth or a gambling addiction or whatever. That's internal.
Mhm.
So the journey that I want to watch over the course of a movie is watch a character overcome their internal obstacle. in order to get what they want. So if your character says, I want to save the world from an apocalypse, then the apocalypse is not the real antagonist. The apocalypse is just the plot. What they're really up against is their pride. Like say there's someone who can never be wrong and nobody can ever tell them anything. So you want to save the world, but you're unteachable. So when I watch the movie, I watch you get humbled so you can learn how to teach, so you can learn how to learn something for once. And then when you open yourself up to being humble, you understand the like science that can really save the world because you realize your muscle and what you know and your bravery is not going to do it.
Yeah.
So, for example, if this is a boy meets girl here, right? Oh my gosh, she's the most beautiful, smart, funny girl I've ever seen. But boy is an alcoholic. So, know the girl here, and here she finally says yes. We're finally going out on a date. So he thinks he's getting what he wants without changing.
Mm.
And then we move towards that's the climax, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we move towards the trigger, which,
He shows up to the date drunk.
right, like happens, oh my gosh, about here. It's the beginning of the end. It's something small though. It's like a wink. It's like a chink in the armor. So it's
Mm.
like their relationship is going well, and then she's in his car in the passenger seat and she picks up something and she's like, why do you have tiny bottles of liquor? And then things go back to being fine, right?
Yeah.
But that's just the evidence that things are about to go downhill.
Mhm.
And this is the lowest point. This is when boy loses everything. He loses the job. He loses the girl. He loses the respect of his parents. He loses custody of his kid. He loses custody of his dog. He loses it all, right? Every movie ever has this point where they've lost it all. And then the main character has to make a decision. Will there be lasting change? So lasting change would be him being like, I need to go to AA and I don't care if I win the job back or the girl back or the whatever. I have to do this because clearly I'm killing myself.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, you have the conclusion, which is him possibly getting the girl back, or maybe he never gets the girl back, but he gets, the respect of his parents again and custody with his son once a week or whatever. Okay. So that is the most typical story that we'll see. In your case, when you have a character who um is likely not an alcoholic, then it's the same trajectory, but it's more subtle,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what your character may be dealing with may be, let's say, she wants to like pass this bill, right? I know this is not the story you're telling, but she wants to see this bill passed that would save millions of people's lives, okay? But what she's up against is a lack of self-worth that has nothing to do with the bill. It's just she's a woman in the world. Most women have that. So her status quo, things are not going well, but then something happens here, her inciting incident where she gets the opportunity to like lobby for this thing, and that changes her life. So she thinks she gets what she wants when her first trip to Capitol Hill, but when she gets up there, she's razzled by all of these like big politicians who were telling her she doesn't belong, blah, blah, blah. And so she finally gets to say her speech and she crumbles because she
Mhm.
hasn't changed a thing inside. Everything doesn't have to be, I think sometimes we as writers feel like the moral authority on our characters. We are not the moral authority. It is not our job to judge or not to judge our characters. That's not our place. Our job is just to tell the story. So we're mirrors. We just reflect it back to the world. So when things crumble, she's now on a journey to deal with the internal thing that needs to be fixed. And so it's a battle. My students are probably tired of seeing me do this, but it is. It's a battle, right? It's a back and forth. It's what I want is up against the wound that has not been healed yet. And sometimes the wound wins, sometimes the want wins. So at the point of a trigger, it could be that her ex comes back from law school and he says something. People know you, like knows how to just get in there. And so he says something that sort of sends her down a spiral. And as much as she's fighting to get this bill done, she's sort of falling apart, blah, blah, you know. And so maybe she gives up and she's like, I can't make a change. People can't make a change. Nobody's made a change. Nobody in my family's ever made a change. Nobody I've ever known has made a change. And so she kind of loses it all until she decides, you know what? I don't care whether I'm able to change the law or not. In my own small sphere of influence, I know this is right. So I'm going to go down to the church and I'm going to make sure that everybody has access to clean blankets. And that's all I'm going to do. And then some congressman comes in town and it's like, I got your bill. I saw what you did. And I can't, we don't have enough votes to change it, but here's what I'm going to do. I can approve funding for blah, blah. Anyway, that's a terrible story that I just made up in my head. But that's kind of how it can work in different scenarios and how we can use this structure. One thing that taught me a lot about storytelling, the importance of storytelling, was when I was a funder at Sundance Institute in the documentary film program, just because access to documentary gives you access to so many stories all around the world. And there's this one documentary that I saw in 2011. Gosh, it was an old documentary even then. That was a long time ago. But it was about this one lady, this white lady was making a documentary about this one tribe. I don't remember where they were. I want to say maybe Nevada. I don't remember exactly where. But she was talking about how like there was like the people on one hand, you can count the amount of people who still spoke their language. And she was trying very, 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 very quickly to document it before like the last elders died. I don't know whatever happened to those people, but it is kind of urgent. No pressure. It is kind of urgent that certain stories are told because movies don't die.
Exactly.
Yeah, but movies don't die. And those of us who tell stories, I mean, music doesn't die either. There's certain things that don't die. And so those of us who tell stories in certain formats, um, if we take up the responsibility of telling stories, um, we are we are preserving we're preserving culture in a way that extends beyond us,
Hmm.
um, which is extremely powerful.
Absolutely. Oh, I love this. Thank you.
There's an exact point. Like there, to your point, there's like in real life, there was a distinctive shift from the kinds of writers and showrunners that were making shows and the kind of shows that were being greenlit.
Mm-hmm.
And it changed very quickly. Like there's one show that if you look at it, it's another one of those like ensemble Black shows that we all know the theme song for. That if you look at the kinds of stories that were being told in the first few seasons,
Mm-hmm.
they were super relatable. And then like out of nowhere, the beginning of the next season, it just seemed really watered down. And then you go look at IMDb and you're like, oh, the colors of the writers changed. And this got really sanitized.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the bad news. Here's the good news is that storytelling has become so democratized, not because anybody wanted it to be that way, but because capitalism and because of social media, we're all having conversations with each other in a way that nobody is in charge of managing. So we all find each other, and authenticity is something that we have demanded. That doesn't mean we're getting it. It's just we're demanding it. So we're very critical of what we see now in a way that we weren't, and we're very vocal about it. And then let's say if I see something and I'm like, I don't know why I don't like it. I just don't. But then I hear some like really smart person on TikTok articulate historically and culturally exactly why. in a way that I couldn't even think to articulate it, and that goes viral, then that show is dead in the water because of that conversation that's now happening. Okay, so what does that have to do with us? What's happening is that even though with all that's happening in the entertainment industry, there are less and less opportunities, and not even because people are mean and evil, mostly just because the financing has changed. People are more risk adverse because there's less money because of everything that's happened. Things slowed down after COVID, and then we had all of these strikes, and then with all of the fires, there's so many executives who lost their homes. They're not like taking meetings. People are trying to put their lives back together. And so things have slowed way down in a lot of ways. Now, while all of that is happening in the industry, there are other entities that are looking to capitalize off of storytellers and give opportunities to storytellers that didn't exist before. So, um, companies like YouTube and TikTok and different places that are looking to get into longer form storytelling don't have these big budgets that the studios have. They have smaller budgets, and so they're willing to hire storytellers that are more emerging. And that's where we come in. And I think these stories can be a lot more contagious because they're a lot more authentic. And so I think there's a little bit of an unintended perfect storm that's on the horizon. I don't think that we've really seen the height of that yet, or even the strong beginnings of that yet, but I do think it's what's happening. And that's why I'm encouraging writers to do two main things. One, continue to work and not be discouraged by the lack of opportunities, because I do think opportunities are coming. And two, to understand the business of film and television. When you understand the business, I mean, if you've looked at my page, you know I talk about this all the time, and I kind of geek out about it, but I think it's important because those of us who are artists sometimes have a tradition of only focusing on the art. And we need to understand how the commerce works so we can be sustainable. If we only focus on the art and not on the business, that means that we can create a wealth of art, but when with no commerce behind it, we have to then spend most of our labor, most of our energy going towards surviving in ways that are not artistic. And so over time, we end up bowing out of the field. I don't want that to happen because your voices are important. So if you get busy working at wherever you're working and you don't have time to create art, then I've created a monster because you have all this knowledge now, but you're not making money off of it. And don't let life happen. Don't let a parent get sick. Don't let you get pregnant unexpectedly. Don't let you have to move and you didn't plan on moving, or something happens to your car. Something happens to your car and you have to get in the car and you have to do all this stuff. You don't have time to write. You don't have money to focus on it. And that very special voice that we needed is now missing. So that's why I want you to understand the business so you can make money at doing that. It's very important um, for the field at large that your voice isn't missing. So that's my soapbox.